A young man arrives at an upscale restaurant, covered head to toe in mud for his first blind date with a sophisticated single mother, who demanded perfection, but what she discovers about why he looks like he crawled through a disaster zone makes her question everything she thought she knew about judging people by their appearance. And the moment she learns the truth about what happened on his way to meet her, she realizes this muddy stranger might be the most remarkable man she has ever encountered, and her reaction when he tries to leave, thinking he has embarrassed her, will restore your faith in humanity. Because sometimes the messiest outsides hide the most beautiful hearts, and what unfolds next between these two unlikely souls proves that real character shows up when nobody is watching. And this single mother is about to learn a lesson about first impressions that will change her life forever. Sarah Mitchell sat at the corner table of Bella Vista, one of the most elegant restaurants in downtown Seattle, nervously checking her phone for the 5th time in 10 minutes. She was a 32-year-old single mother who had not been on a date in almost 3 years after her divorce left her emotionally exhausted and financially strained. Raising her 7-year-old daughter Emma, alone while working as a nurse at the local hospital, consumed most of her energy, and the thought of opening her heart again terrified her. But her best friend Rebecca had been relentless about setting her up on this blind date, insisting that Jake Thompson was different from all the other guys. Rebecca knew him through her husband, who worked at the same construction company, and according to Rebecca, Jake was kind, hardworking, and genuine. Exactly what Sarah needed after her ex-husband, who had been charming on the surface but cruel behind closed doors. Sarah had very specific expectations for tonight. She had chosen this upscale restaurant intentionally wanting to see if Jake could handle himself in a sophisticated setting. She wore her best navy blue dress and had spent an hour on her hair and makeup, telling herself that if she was going to dip her toes back into the dating pool, she would do it right. The restaurant buzzed with quiet conversation, the sound of classical music drifting through the air mixed with the gentle clinking of wine glasses and silverware. She glanced at her watch. It was 7:15, and Jake was already 15 minutes late. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that always came when someone let her down. Her ex-husband had been chronically late, always making excuses, always putting himself first. She told herself to give Jake 5 more minutes before leaving, just as she was reaching for her purse to check her phone again. She heard a commotion near the entrance. Several diners gasped, and Sarah looked up to see something that made her freeze in disbelief. A young man stood at the hostess stand, completely covered in mud. His clothes were soaked and brown, his face streaked with dirt, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, and his shoes left muddy footprints on the pristine marble floor. The hostess looked horrified, taking a step back as if the mud might be contagious, but the man seemed frantic, his eyes scanning the restaurant desperately until they landed on Sarah. He started walking toward her table, and Sarah felt her heart sink with a mixture of embarrassment and shock. This could not be happening. This muddy disaster could not be her blind date, but as he approached, she could see the desperation in his eyes, and something else too, something that looked like genuine distress. "Excuse me, are you Sarah?" the man asked, his voice breathless and apologetic. "I am so incredibly sorry. I know how this looks, but please let me explain. I am Jake Thompson." Sarah stared at him, unable to form words around them. The entire restaurant had gone silent, every eye fixed on the muddy man standing before her table. Sarah felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment. This was worse than she could have imagined. Not only was her date late, but he had shown up looking like he had been wrestling pigs. Her first instinct was anger. How dare he disrespect her time and this evening by showing up in such a state? But before she could speak, Jake continued, his words tumbling out rapidly. "I was on my way here. I left early because I did not want to be late. I was driving down Market Street when I saw a car accident happen right in front of me. A sedan had swerved to avoid hitting a dog and crashed into a drainage, ditched the car, flipped onto its side, and started sliding toward the water. There was a woman inside screaming, and I could see 2 small children in the back seat. The car was filling with muddy water from the ditch, and they could not get out." Sarah felt her anger begin to shift into something else as she listened to Jake speak. There was no hint of excuse-making in his voice, only raw emotion. He continued, the words coming faster. "I did not even think. I just pulled over and ran down into that ditch. The mud was up to my waist, and the current from the drainage water was strong. I managed to get the back door open and pulled out the 2 kids first, a boy, maybe 5, and a girl. Around 3, they were terrified and crying, but they were okay then. I helped the mother climb out. She had hurt her leg, but she was conscious and able to move by the time I got them all up to the road. People had stopped, and someone had called 911, the ambulance. Arrived maybe 10 minutes ago. Jake paused, taking a shaky breath, and Sarah noticed for the first time that his hands were trembling. I know I should have called you. I know I should have canceled or rescheduled, but honestly, the only thing I could think about after the paramedics took over was getting here. Because Rebecca told me how hard it was for you to agree to this date and how you had not been out in years, and I did. Not want you to think I was the kind of guy who just does not show up or who does not care. I thought maybe if I could just get here and explain in person, you would understand that. I am not normally like this. I promise I clean up well. Sarah sat, completely still, processing everything Jake had just said around them. The restaurant remained silent, but the quality of the silence had changed it. Was no longer judgmental, but captivated, as if everyone was holding their breath waiting to see what would happen next. She looked at Jake, really looked at him, and saw past the mud for the first time. His eyes were kind. Despite the stress in them, there was a cut on his cheek, probably from the broken glass of the car window, and his clothes were not just muddy, but torn in places where he had clearly exerted himself physically, saving those people. He was shivering slightly, probably from the cold. Wet clothes clinging to his body. Sarah felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been locked away for a very long time. You saved 3 people tonight, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded, looking down at his muddy shoes. I just did what anyone would do. Sarah shook her head slowly. No, not anyone would do that. Most people would have driven past or waited for professionals to handle it. You risked your own safety to save strangers, a mother and her children. She felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, thinking about her own daughter, Emma, at home with the babysitter. What if that had been them? What if Emma had been one of those children trapped in that car, and someone like Jake had not been there to help? She stood up suddenly, and Jake took a step back, looking worried, as if he expected her to slap him or storm out. But instead, Sarah did something that surprised even herself. She reached out and took his muddy hand in hers, not caring that the dirt immediately transferred to her skin. Sit down, she said firmly. You are not leaving. Jake looked stunned. But Sarah, I am a mess. I cannot sit here like this. I am getting mud everywhere, and you look so beautiful, and I have completely ruined your evening. I should just go home, and we can try this another time if you even want to. After all this, Sarah tightened her grip on his hand. You listen to me, Jake? Thompson, you showed up tonight after doing something incredibly brave and selfless. And if you think I am the kind of person who cares more about a clean restaurant than about human decency, then you do not know me at all. Now sit down before you fall down. You look like you are about to collapse. Jake hesitated for another moment, then slowly sank into the chair across from her, leaving muddy smears on the upholstered seat. The hostess rushed over, looking panicked. I am so sorry, ma'am. We can move you to another table, or perhaps... Sarah cut her off with a smile. It is fine. We are staying right here. Could you please bring us 2 glasses of water and maybe a stack of napkins? The hostess nodded, still looking bewildered, and hurried away as Jake sat there looking utterly confused. Sarah felt something shift inside her. She had spent 3 years building walls around her heart, protecting herself from being hurt. Again, she had convinced herself that she needed someone, perfect someone, who met all her criteria, someone who would never disappoint her. But looking at this muddy, exhausted man who had sacrificed his own comfort and safety to help strangers, she realized that perfection was not about clean clothes and punctuality. It was about character and heart. Tell me about them, Sarah said gently. The family you saved, are they going to be okay? Jake took a deep breath, seeming to relax slightly now that he realized Sarah was not going to throw him out. The paramedics said the kids seemed fine, just scared and cold. The mother had a possible broken ankle and some bruising, but she was conscious and talking. She kept thanking me over and over, crying and hugging her kids. He paused, his voice growing thick with emotion. It reminded me of my own mom. Actually, she raised me and my 2 sisters alone after my dad died when I was 8, and I remember how fiercely she protected us, how she would have done anything for us. Seeing that woman in the car so desperate to save her children, I could not walk away. Sarah felt tears spilling down her cheeks. Now, not bothering to wipe them away, I am a single mother too, she said softly. My daughter, Emma, is 7, and she is my whole world. And hearing what you did tonight, knowing that somewhere there is a mother who gets to tuck her babies into bed because of you, she trailed off. Unable to finish the sentence, Jake reached across the table with his muddy hand, and Sarah met him halfway, their fingers intertwining despite the dirt. "I am sorry I ruined our first date," he said with a small, sad smile. Sarah laughed through her tears. "You did not ruin anything, you just showed me exactly who you are, and honestly that is more valuable than 1,000 perfect dinners at fancy restaurants," the hostess returned with water and a large stack of napkins, along with the manager who had clearly been summoned to handle the muddy customer situation. But before the manager could speak, an elderly woman from a nearby table stood up and walked over. "Excuse me," she said, addressing Jake. "I could not help but overhear your story, and I just wanted to say thank you for being the kind of person who stops to help. You are a hero, young man." Truly, the manager looked between the elderly woman and Jake, his stern expression softening. "Is this true, sir? Did you really save a family from a car accident tonight?" Jake nodded, looking embarrassed by the attention. "I just did what needed to be done." The manager smiled suddenly. "If you will allow me, I would like to offer you both dinner on the house tonight. And sir, we will bring you some towels, and if you would like, we have a private dining room in the back, where you might be more comfortable." Jake looked at Sarah questioningly, and she squeezed his hand. "I think we are fine right here," she said, "but thank you." As the evening progressed, something magical happened. Other diners began coming over to their table, offering words of encouragement and praise. One man, who turned out to be a firefighter, shook Jake's hand vigorously. Another woman, who said she was a paramedic, gave him her card and told him he should consider emergency response training. The restaurant staff brought out warm bread and soup on the house, followed by the finest steaks and vegetables. Sarah and Jake talked for hours. The conversation flowing easily despite the unusual circumstances. Jake told her about his work in construction, how he had started as a laborer right out of high school to help support his family and worked his way up to foreman. He talked about his sisters, both of whom he was incredibly proud of, and how his mother had recently retired after 30 years. As a school teacher, he spoke about his hobbies, hiking and woodworking, and his dream of someday building his own house from the ground up. Sarah shared her own story, the painful divorce from a man who had seemed perfect on paper, but who had been emotionally abusive and controlling. She talked about the struggle of single parenthood, the constant juggling of work and childcare, and the fear that she would never be able to trust anyone again. She told him about Emma, who loved dinosaurs and wanted to be a paleontologist, and how every decision she made was with her daughter's well-being in mind. As they talked, Sarah realized something profound. She had been so focused on finding someone who looked right on paper that she had forgotten to look for someone who was right in their soul. Jake was not wealthy or particularly sophisticated. He had shown up covered in mud to their first date, but he had also shown her something far more important. He had shown her that he was brave, compassionate, and selfless, that he would sacrifice his own comfort to help others, and that he understood the value of showing up even when circumstances made it difficult. By the time they finished their meal, it was almost 11 o'clock. The restaurant was beginning to empty out, and Jake had dried out somewhat, though he still looked thoroughly disheveled. Sarah did not want the evening to end. "I should probably get going," Jake said reluctantly. "I have work early tomorrow, and I need to go home and shower." "For about 3 hours to get all this mud off," Sarah laughed. "Can I see you again?" she asked, her heart pounding because despite everything, or perhaps because of everything she knew, she wanted this man in her life. Jake's face lit up. "Really, you actually want to see me again after all this?" "Absolutely," Sarah said. "I want to see you again, and I want you to meet Emma. I think you two would get along great." Jake grinned, that crooked, wonderful grin that Sarah was already beginning to love. "Would like that very much," he said. "I promise, next time I will show up clean, maybe even wear a suit." Sarah shook her head. "Just show up as yourself, that is all I need." They walked out of the restaurant together, and Jake insisted on walking Sarah to her car, even though his own vehicle was parked several blocks away in the opposite direction. When they reached her car, Sarah turned to face him. "Thank you," she said, "for tonight, for saving those people, for showing up, for being exactly who you are." Jake stepped closer, closing the distance between them. Even covered in dried mud, he somehow managed to look incredibly handsome in the dim parking lot lighting. "Thank you for giving me a chance, even when I looked like a swamp monster," Sarah laughed. And then, before she could overthink it, she leaned in and kissed him softly on the lips, not caring about the dirt or the mess, caring only about the incredible man beneath it all. Jake kissed her back gently, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. When They finally pulled apart. They were both smiling. "I will call you tomorrow," Jake promised. "Definitely call me," Sarah said as she got into her car. She watched him walk away in her rear view mirror, this muddy, limping hero who had stumbled into her life in the most unexpected way, and she knew with absolute certainty that this was just the beginning of something extraordinary. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the same restaurant, wearing the same navy blue dress, watching as Jake walked through the door. At this time, he was wearing a suit, his hair neatly combed, his shoes polished, but Sarah had to admit she had a soft spot for that muddy version of him, to the one who had shown her what really mattered. Emma was with Rebecca tonight, and Jake had promised Sarah a special evening to celebrate 3 months together. As he approached the table, Sarah stood to greet him, and he pulled her into his arms. "I have something to ask you," he said, his voice serious. Sarah felt her heart skip. "What is it?" Jake took her hands in his, looking into her eyes. "I have been thinking a lot about that first night, when I showed up here looking like a disaster, and you gave me a chance when most people would have walked away. You saw past the surface to who I really was, and that changed my life, Sarah. I am not perfect. I am still just a construction worker who will probably show up late sometimes because I stopped to help a stranded motorist or rescue a cat from a tree, but I promise you this, I will always show up, I will always care, and I will always put you and Emma first." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Sarah gasped as he opened it to reveal a simple but beautiful diamond ring. "Sarah Mitchell, will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she nodded. "Yes, absolutely yes." Jake slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her, as the restaurant erupted in applause. Sarah realized that sometimes the best things in life come wrapped in the most unexpected packages, sometimes covered in mud, and sometimes exactly when you have given up hope. And as she looked into the eyes of the man who had risked everything to save strangers, she knew that she had found something rare and precious: true love built not on perfection, but on character, compassion, and the courage to show up even when life gets messy.